Lisa and Max, brother and sister, went to their grandmother's village as they did every summer. Their parents left them for a couple of months while they went on a trip across Europe. The children loved this place, an old but sturdy wooden cabin, surrounded by dense forests, the scent of freshly cut grass, and the warmth of the summer sun. Their grandmother met them at the doorstep with a warm smile, her wrinkled face glowing with joy. She immediately sat them down at the table, serving them hot berry pies that smelled as if a piece of summer had been baked into them. Everything was just as it always had been. Nothing seemed to have changed, but Lisa felt something strange, something subtle, like a faint breeze brushing against her back. Her grandmother's gaze lingered on her a little longer than usual. Something cold flickered in her eyes, fleeting and ungraspable, like a shadow passing through her pupils. Lisa dismissed it. She was probably just tired from the journey. The days passed peacefully. They wandered through the forest, gathered mushrooms, swam in the lake. Their grandmother cooked delicious meals and told bedtime stories in the evenings. But at night something was wrong. Lisa couldn't sleep. She kept waking up with the feeling that someone was watching her. The first time when she opened her eyes, she saw that the door to her room was slightly ajar, a narrow gap where the darkness seemed thicker than in the rest of the house. She didn't remember leaving it open. The second night, she heard sounds, quiet, scratching noises, as if someone was dragging their nails across the wooden floor. Max slept beside her, breathing peacefully, unaware of anything strange. And on the third night, she woke up to breathing. Heavy, slow breathing. It came from the corner of the room. Lisa didn't move. She knew that if she turned her head, she would see something she wasn't supposed to see. But she didn't have to look. In the darkness, a quiet, rasping voice spoke, deep and foreign. "You are not mine, but soon you will be." By morning, everything looked normal. Grandmother made pancakes, placed cups of milk in front of them, and smiled. But Lisa noticed something. Max ate with his usual appetite, but she couldn't swallow a single bite. Something had changed. Their grandmother sat across from them, and there was something odd about her movements, subtle, yet disturbing. Lisa couldn't quite figure out what it was. Maybe her fingers seemed just a little too long, or her lips moved strangely when she chewed. After breakfast, their grandmother went to the pantry for flour. Summoning her courage, Lisa peeked after her. The old woman walked slowly across the floor, but in the reflection of the glass cabinet, she moved just a little differently, as if her shadow was a moment behind. Lisa gripped her fork tighter. "Why do you look so pale?" Max asked. She wanted to tell him, but froze. Their grandmother had returned, and her gaze was once again too long, too intense. Her lips stretched into a smile. "Are you all right, dear Lisa?" she asked, leaning closer. Her breath smelled bitter, like rot. Lisa nodded, but inside everything clenched. She didn't know what was happening, but one thing was clear. Their grandmother was not the same. The next morning, Lisa didn't tell Max about the voice she had heard in the night. Maybe it had just been a dream. Maybe. But her hands trembled as she held her spoon at breakfast. As always, their grandmother placed steaming bowls of porridge before them, but the smell of the food seemed strange now. It used to be warm and comforting, but now there was a faint bitterness to it. Their grandmother sat across from them, as she always did. But something was wrong. Lisa didn't realize what it was at first, but then she noticed. Her eyes. They seemed empty. Not just old and tired, but lifeless. Deep and hollow, they reflected the light in a strange, unnatural way. Lisa gripped her spoon tighter. "Grandma, are you okay?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Her grandmother looked at her and smiled. Her lips stretched wider than they should have, and something black flickered deep in her pupils. "Of course, dear," she said, running a hand across Lisa's face. Her fingers were cold, ice cold. Max, who never worried about anything, finished his food without a care. "You're imagining things again," he told Lisa. "Stop it." But Lisa couldn't stop. She didn't know what had changed, but her grandmother felt like a stranger now. That afternoon, they went for a walk in the forest. Their grandmother warned them not to go past the old ravine, but Max just waved it off. Lisa felt like something was watching them, But whenever she turned around, she only saw trees, gnarled branches that looked like outstretched fingers. "Doesn't it feel darker here?" she murmured. "It's just the clouds," Max replied indifferently, walking ahead. But Lisa knew it wasn't the clouds. The shadows in the forest were unnatural, as if light simply couldn't reach certain places. It felt like something was standing between the trees, invisible yet real. Then suddenly they heard a sound, a low, heavy noise like deep breathing. That's not the wind," Lisa whispered. Max suddenly grabbed her hand. His face had gone pale. "We need to go back," he said. They ran without looking back, and only when the cabin appeared between the trees did Lisa hear a whisper behind her, a muffled, raspy sound, as if coming from the throat of something that didn't know how to speak. "You should not be here." That night she woke up again, but this time not from the breathing, from the rustling. Something was moving in the hallway. The footsteps were light but unnaturally fast. They moved as if whatever made them wasn't walking, but gliding across the floor. Lisa pulled the blanket over herself, afraid to breathe. Max continued sleeping, but this time, even in his sleep, his face was tense. And then the footsteps stopped. Right outside the door. The doorknob turned slowly, a quiet click. The gap between the door and the frame widened by a few millimeters, and Lisa saw something. It wasn't her grandmother. It was taller, thinner, its neck too long, its arms stretched unnaturally. Through the narrow strip of light, something else seeped into the room. Something ancient, something hungry. It was watching her. Deep inside, Lisa knew, if she pulled the blanket further over herself, if she closed her eyes, it would still know she was there. The creature tilted its head, and then, Grandmother whispered, "Sleep, my dear." And the door shut. Lisa didn't sleep until morning. She lay motionless, hidden under the blanket, listening to the rustling behind the door. It never stopped. Something was moving through the house, too light, too fast. There was a quiet scratching sound, like claws dragging along the wall. Sometimes she heard a faint chuckle. She didn't know if minutes or hours had passed, but at some point, everything fell silent. Only silence remained, but it brought no relief. It was thick, heavy, as if the house was waiting for her to fall asleep again. When morning finally came, Lisa got out of bed on shaking legs. Max seemed to have heard nothing. He yawned and stretched as if he had slept soundly. She watched him, envious. At breakfast, Grandmother was smiling again, but now her smile looked more like a stretched mask. Her eyes seemed even deeper, their dark pupils nearly swallowing the irises. Lisa noticed that the skin on her hands had become dry, rough, cracked. "How did you sleep, children?" Grandmother asked. Her voice was soft, but behind it, something foreign lurked. "Good," Max lied, stuffing a piece of pie into his mouth. Lisa didn't respond. She watched as Grandmother ate. No, she wasn't eating. She tore chunks of dough with her unnaturally long fingers and brought them to her mouth, but her lips barely moved. They were eerily still, as if the thing sitting across from her was merely imitating human gestures. Suddenly, Grandmother lifted her head and stared directly at Lisa. "You look tired, my dear," she whispered. "You need more sleep." Her lips moved, but the voice seemed to come from somewhere deep inside, from within, from the void. During the day, Lisa convinced Max to go into the forest under the pretense of gathering mushrooms. She couldn't stay in the house a minute longer. Grandmother watched them from the window as they left. Her face was hidden in shadow, but Lisa was sure. She wasn't blinking. The forest felt safer. Sunlight filtered through the canopy. Birds sang. But the farther they went, the more something felt wrong. Lisa noticed the sounds beginning to fade. The birds stopped singing. The leaves no longer rustled. Even the air became still. "Lisa, look!" Max suddenly exclaimed. She turned and saw footprints, deep, uneven, as if someone had walked barefoot on the damp earth. But something was off. The footprints didn't start or end. They were just there. Max crouched to examine them, but Lisa yanked him back sharply. "We're leaving. Now!" But it was too late. Somewhere ahead, a whisper broke the silence. Faint, raspy, as if spoken through thick fabric. "Lisa! She froze. Max heard it too. His face turned pale. "Who's there?" he shouted. The whisper turned into a low, strained chuckle. Branches snapped, and Lisa saw movement between the trees. Something white, pale, with elongated limbs. It slowly straightened from the shadows, arching its unnaturally long back. It didn't move like a person. Max grabbed Lisa's hand. They turned and ran without looking back. Their hearts pounded, their lungs burned, but behind them the footsteps grew faster. When they burst out of the forest, Grandmother was already standing on the porch. She watched them, her head tilted slightly to the side. "Where have you been, children?" she asked with that same empty smile. "I was getting worried." Lisa looked into her eyes and she knew. The thing standing before them wasn't worried at all. Lisa and Max stepped into the house, breathless. The air inside was stale, as if someone had recently sealed all the windows shut. Grandmother continued to watch them, her head slowly tilting to the side. Lisa noticed a strange fold on her neck, as if the skin there no longer belonged to her. "You look frightened, children." Her voice was lower now, as if something was stuck in her throat. Max squeezed Lisa's hand. The room fell into an eerie silence. Grandmother turned and slowly walked toward the kitchen. Her steps were unhurried, yet they echoed with a dull, wet resonance, as if something heavy was shifting inside her. Lisa swallowed with difficulty. "We have to leave," she whispered to Max. "And how do we do that?" he whispered back. At that moment, something began to scratch behind the wall. Slowly, methodically, Lisa turned and saw the old wooden cabinet trembling, as if something was pulling it from the inside. The noise repeated, but closer this time. Then, a new sound, a loud crack, like a bone snapping inside the wall. Grandmother stood by the stove, her back slightly arched. She was cutting something, and the knife struck the cutting board too sharply, again and again. Lisa noticed that Grandmother's fingers were moving unnaturally fast. "Sweetheart, aren't you eating?" a voice called out. Grandmother didn't turn around. "No," Lisa whispered, clenching her fists. At that moment, Max let out a muffled gasp. Lisa looked at him, and her heart clenched. His lips were trembling, his eyes wide. He was looking down. A hand was reaching out from under the table, thin, grayish, with long, sharp nails. It crept slowly across the floor with trembling fingers, inching toward his leg. Lisa screamed and yanked her brother back, toppling the chair. Grandmother flinched and snapped her head toward them, but her eyes, they were not hers. The whites had disappeared, leaving only enormous, dilated pupils staring at them without any expression. Her lips parted, revealing jagged, unnaturally long teeth. "You were not supposed to come back." Her voice had changed, deeper now, hollow, as if coming from an empty room. Max grabbed Lisa's hand, and they bolted toward the door. But the moment Lisa reached for the handle, the door vanished. It was still in front of them, but there was no exit anymore, only a solid wall. "Oh no," Max whispered. They turned back. Grandmother was no longer smiling. Her body was changing. Her fingers stretched, her skin cracked, and her mouth widened, as if something inside was pulling it open from within. "Children!" The voice echoed from everywhere at once. Too late. The walls of the house shifted. They were breathing. Lisa screamed. She and Max pressed themselves against the wall, their hearts pounding so hard they felt like they might burst. Grandmother no longer moved like a person. She glided across the floor, her body twitching, her joints bending at unnatural angles. Her eyes were now voids of solid blackness, swallowing everything. Suddenly, the wall stopped moving. Everything froze. Grandmother turned back to the stove, picked something up from the tray, and faced them again, her wide, eerily familiar smile stretching across her face. "Children, I baked you a pie," she said. On the table in front of them sat the pie. A wave of rotten stench hit them. The crust was dark brown, speckled with green mold, and something slimy oozed from within, resembling raw meat. Lisa's stomach clenched, and she fought the urge to retch. Max clamped his hands over his nose, his eyes filling with tears. "Eat, don't be afraid." Grandmother's voice was low, vibrating. "I worked so hard, just for you." Lisa grabbed Max's hand and yanked her phone from her pocket. She quickly dialed their mother's number. The ringing tone, 1, 2, 3. No one answered. Come on, she whispered through trembling lips. The ringing stopped, but instead of their mother's voice, a deep, rasping laughter echoed from the speaker. It wasn't human. It was wet, guttural, as if bubbling up from deep within the earth. You will not escape, the voice hissed through the speaker. Lisa shuddered. Max clung to her arm, but grandmother took a step forward. Her mouth stretched wider than it should have, and inside, jagged, grotesquely long teeth gleamed. Smells delicious, doesn't it? Her voice had become a low, guttural growl. Lisa made one final desperate move. She grabbed the knife from the table and, without thinking, plunged it into grandmother's hand. The blade sank in with a wet squelch, but instead of blood, thick black sludge oozed from the wound. Grandmother did not scream. She did not even flinch. She slowly lowered her gaze to the wound, then looked back at Lisa. You hurt me, she whispered, but the corners of her mouth continued stretching upward. The shadows in the room thickened. They crawled over the ceiling, the floor, the walls. Everything around them was vanishing, leaving only grandmother and her grandchildren. Lisa clutched Max's hand. Run! She screamed, but it was too late. The shadows closed in around them. The last thing Lisa saw was grandmother, standing in the darkness, frozen in a smile, holding out a piece of the rotting pie.
If this story made your heart race, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Hit the like button to support new chilling tales and tap the bell. That way, you won't miss the next dose of horror. In the comments, let us know how much you enjoyed the story and which themes scare you the most. Who knows? Maybe your idea will become the next nightmare.